Okay, so I'm here with Andrew Phillip, author of The Ambulance Box, and we're just going to have a chat today. I'm coming to you from Ojai, California, a little sleepy town on the west coast, and Andrew, you're coming to us from where?
From Linlithgow in West Lothian in Scotland.
Wow.
Just a small town to the west of Edinburgh.
Great. And you studied in Edinburgh, is that right?
I did, yes. I studied linguistics at Edinburgh University. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yes, I graduated in '98.
Cool, cool. Well, this book, first of all, congratulations. I think it's a tremendous collection of poems. I was moved by it and piqued my interest in a lot of different ways. Um, One of my sort of questions for you today is about the book itself. It's in its third printing. Is that right?
It is, yeah.
So congratulations on that. That's great news.
Thank you.
People often say that a work sort of takes on a life of its own after it's been published. What's been your experience of having the book out there? Have there been any reactions to the book that have surprised you or changed your point of view about your own work? What's it like having it out there in the public, as it were?
It's an interesting experience. Yeah, it's for me. It's been very heartening and very encouraging. I think the reactions so far have really confirmed what I hoped about the book, what I felt. What I really felt myself, but hoped that other people would feel about it and about its quality and its intensity and power and range. I'm pleased that people have commented on its coherence, its cohesion, and its range. I'm very pleased that people have been moved by it and inspired by it. As far as taking on a life of its own is concerned, it's strange the little things you hear. For example, my mother-in-law gave a copy of the book to a friend of hers who took it to a poetry reading group that she goes to, and she read the poem "Improvisation for the Angel Who Announces the End of Time," which is dedicated to the composer Olivier Messiaen. And she read that to her group, and they were all very taken by it. And one of them said that she wanted to take it away and use it for a group that she goes to that sets pieces to music and dance. So that poem may well be taking on a life of its own in very many ways. So
an dance incarnation, as it were, which is probably
possibly, yes, that may.
Well,
that's incredible.
Wonderful. Oh, that's wonderful. It definitely it's been wonderful to connect through the web. I think we may not have met had there not been an internet for us to be able to engage, and certainly we wouldn't be doing this today if it weren't for technology. How do you feel about the sort of changing landscape of publication and online publication and this sort of brave new world of the internet? Is it bringing us together? Is it flinging us apart? Is it changing poetry in any way? Is it changing you?
I think well, it does. It probably does all these things and more besides. I mean, it certainly has brought us together. It's brought me together with other people who I know virtually, and some of whom I've met in the flesh. It's wonderful to be able to connect with people who've bought the book. The world of blogs and Facebook. You find people who've bought the book who you don't know. You've never had any connection with them, and suddenly you find somebody somewhere saying, "Oh, I bought this book and it's great," and that's wonderful. To find that the people who you don't know are buying the book because you almost suspect. You put something out there and think, "Well, I hope other people will buy it," but your friends are going to buy it. People and who say they like your work are likely to buy it, but it's just hugely encouraging when complete strangers reveal online that they've bought the book, and you find that. As far as online publications concerned, I mean, I think online magazines are probably, they're gaining in importance. I don't see there's no problem with them. I think there are some fantastic online magazines out there. My publisher Salt started up a very good one called Horizon Magazine, which is available through Salt's website. That's www.saltpublishing.com. And there's some very good quality work in there. There's reviews and there's essays besides poems, and it obviously offers other possibilities for use of hyperlinks and perhaps of Flash and other things that I certainly haven't explored, and I think probably most online magazines are still sort of an internet version of the old print magazine to a great extent. That's still the model that we use, really. That will probably shift over time to a certain extent. What we're doing today, obviously, is made possible by the internet, as you've already said. Just wouldn't happen otherwise. It's fantastic to be able to connect across all these miles and this vast stretch of water and land.
And to find you have something in common as well is incredible.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And as you said, to put faces, little Facebook icons to people who actually read the book. Proof positive that they have a face, that they are out there, that they are reading, which is wonderful. You mentioned your background in linguistics and the range of this book, which I think is tremendous in terms of it being, as you said, sort of both highly experimental in places and also very coherent. I wonder if you talk a little bit about language, about your relationship to language. You speak several of them, and just how you're playing with language in this book, how you're thinking about language and languages, and the relationship between different languages in the ambulance box.
Well, the main core language of the book is English. To varying degrees inflected by my Scottishness, inflected by the Scots language, which kind of interweaves with English in Scotland. I mean, in a linguistic and sociolinguistic mix that's quite complex, and there are some poems in Scots, entirely in Scots, although what entirely in Scots means is somewhat debatable these days. And there are other poems in which Scots finds its way into an otherwise standard English poem. And then there's a bit of Gaelic here and there in the book, finding its way into poems in English or in Scots. Sometimes as a title, sometimes actually in the text. There's a bit of German here and there in the book. Obviously, one of the strong interplays between languages is the translation from German into Scots. I've translated several poems of Rilke's into Scots, including his Orpheus Orchidike Hermes, which is quite a lengthy poem, long narrative poem, which one or two people have said to me is their favourite piece in the book, and those non-Scots speakers as well, which is just quite interesting. For me, obviously, Scots is a strong part of my background. Where I grew up was a fairly Scots-speaking environment. My dad grew up as a Scots speaker, though had that kind of educated into the substratum of his life by university. My mum's from Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is kind of debatable land, just on the south side of the border, but actually was historically was a very important Scottish town. It changed hands between Scotland and England 13 times in the Wars of Independence, way back in the medieval era, and landed up on the English side of the border. So there's interesting questions of identity there. It's quite subtle and interplay. So yeah, Scots is an important part of my background. It's an important part of identity for me. Obviously, there's a political element to using Scots, because Scots is still by many looked down upon as a debased form of English, which is historically and linguistically simply inaccurate. Not least because Scots was the language of the court and of administration and politics within Scotland, at least up until the Union of the Crowns in 1603, sorry, and then was really dealt a further blow by the Union of the Parliaments in 1707. But still hung on in certain aspects, certain areas of Scottish life until the 19th century. The legal system used Scots in the court, and there's still quite a lot of Scots in Scots legal terminology because we have a somewhat separate legal system to the English legal system, even though we're in one United Kingdom. And Gaelic again. Gaelic's a language that I've learnt and still learning. It's the language that I've started learning most recently, really. But obviously, it being a language of Scotland has importance for me, a cultural importance. German is the language that I learnt at school, the main language that I learnt at school. Obviously, Scots and English being Germanic languages, is fairly closely related to the languages that I speak in the home, have spoken throughout my life.
I imagine there's some I imagine there's some interesting discoveries in the process of translating Rilke from German to Scots.
Yes. Some of those discoveries of Scots vocabulary that I wasn't necessarily immediately aware of, and used the dictionary a fair amount in that, but always kind of trying to balance up, dictionary howking, as some people would call it, with a fairly natural and everyday kind of Scots.
I definitely made good use of the Scots dictionary myself in reading through some of the Scots poems, and so it sounds like, in a sense, this is a book that has to do with identity for you, and has to do with where you've come from and who you are, and reconciling a lot of these different elements of language and of life. But at the same time, I found it very accessible. I found that there was a universality about the book as well, so that it wasn't just Andrew's relationship to language going on in this book. There's something much bigger. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about accessibility and about your considerations for writing for a reader versus writing, in a sense, just for yourself, or playing with language. What's the difference between sort of playing with language and making a work of art that's going to speak to someone else in a more universal way?
I think for me, the poem itself is always primary. It comes way before any considerations of its own accessibility, and the poem has to be what it wants to be. I think that's sometimes it's doing what I do have a program in mind for it, perhaps a formal program or a thematic program, but the poem will always assert itself if it doesn't want to go into that shape. And I think some of the poems in the book, one or two of the Scots poems set out, well, one in particular certainly, set out initially being written in English, but didn't work so well in English. And, well, Berlin is the one that I really have in mind. I started drafting that in English and then thought, this might work well in Scots, and it quickly became clear that it worked far better in Scots, and partly because of the interplay of language there was more interesting, and was saying something that the English simply couldn't say. And then the poem grew in Scots in a way that the poem in English didn't and couldn't. And I was, to some extent, concerned about that poem initially, about whether anybody else would relate to it. And I sent it to a couple of friends who I was sending lots of poems to at that point in time. One of them loved it, and the other one couldn't get anywhere with it at all. But I still felt that it had worth. But I kind of thought, who's going to want to publish this? But then actually, my friend Rob A. Mackenzie, whose book The Opposite of Cabbage came out on Salt at the same time as mine, we swapped manuscripts. So we saw one another's books through quite a number of stages of development. And Rob picked that poem out as one of the best in the book, much to my surprise. Although perhaps given his stylistic leanings, it's not that surprising he might pick that one out, but it still did surprise me. And it surprised me how well it's gone over at the one or two readings that I've given it,
well,
in
Andrew,
public.
I'd wonder if you'd be willing to read that poem for us now. Is that something you
Yeah,
love to hear
sure,
from
yeah.
Rob? Yeah.
Yeah. I'll read it through, and if there's anything that you want me to clarify, any references or words, then I'll do that afterwards.
Sure. Yeah, I'd just love to hear the sound of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just take a drink of water first. Quite warm and stuffy here today.
Is it?
Anyway, yeah, yes. This is Berlin, Berlin, Berlin. Or I should say Berlin/Berlin/Berlin. Heute keine Schlagzeile. As if seeing history for the first time. On the S-Bahn, the construction worker sitting anent me transmogrified into an exiled Scot. Potsdamer Platz in a tween. Die Wilmersdorfer Witwen. PDS posters on the streets around Hauptbahnhof. At Turkish coffee, read wine and poetry. The connections between my vocabulary started to unfold. In the Hochhausviertel, the high-rise flats was that dreich in uniform. For a German shop to be cried McPaper felt like a personal insult. I was told most of the green, post-dated the oncome of capitalism. Gänseschmalz, Mohnkuchen, Pfefferminztee, Rauschgift. Doner kebabs with raw Turkish bread and sauces. He was English and couldn't hear the difference between schwul and schwül. She was American and couldn't hear the difference between Hölle and Hölle. Wenn man die Taz als Lektüre nimmt, he pushed his hydrosalaphic son down the carriage, cadging cash for the laddie's operation. The langsomeness of a Palast der Republik. Nostalgie among friends. Arbeiterwohnkasten. Aside the neo-Nazi graffiti for the Edelweiss pirates. After snicking his satchel for the clashing door, he donnered in the carriage singing an aria. She stood on a quiet side street after yin in the morning, waiting on the pedestrian lights turning green. The official dealing with my paperwork shut the door to his office and pecked. Wissen Sie, das ist ein Scheißjob. Heute kein Kommentar. Smiling, she stuck her head through a hole in the wall. Construction. Construction all gates. Construction at ilka level. Construction like you wouldn't credit. Is das die alte Bibel? An old boy on the S-Bahn speared to me. Change at Rosa Luxemburg Platz. For the benefit of the carriage, she muttered calumnies anent the Slavs. Orte des Schreckens, die wir niemals vergessen dürfen. KDW. When Linie U1 resumed its run through to Warschauer Strasse, it was like a gala day. The only books on his shelf, the complete works of Marx, abridged. Up before the dado, queuing for a place in the official queue. Zoologischer Garten!
Wonderful, thank you. That was a wonderful read. One of the things to point out about this poem on the page is that it runs in single lines. So you have a hanging indent where the line runs over, and it seems to me that the musicality of each of the languages is really at the fore in this process. So it's not so much about breaking or interrupting a line as it is about this kind of these lines of music, as it were, that interweave between languages. I wonder if you'd say a bit about the importance of music in poetry, the ear, how that works throughout this book, the use of meter or not. What do you do with music in modern poetry?
The music as a language is deeply important to me, which doesn't, well, that doesn't fuddle me to any kind of formalist position.
Right.
I think one of the things that's a strength, I think, about particularly about poetry in the UK, which I think is perhaps not quite so true of poetry in the States, although it may be becoming more so, is that there's much less of a factionalization in the UK, maybe because we are, and that means that people feel much more able to weave in and out of the formal and freer styles and approaches. And some of the poets who've inspired me most over the past wee while have been poets like that. The late Gael Turnbull, that's Gael, who's a man. His collected poems published by Shearsman Books is a remarkable, remarkably rich compendium of just a poetic imagination. That man's formal imagination was incredible. And yeah, music. Go back to music. Let's go back to music. Yes, music is important to me. I suppose living in an environment in which there's more than one language, there's different levels of language and the sound of different, not just different dialects and different accents, but everything kind of thrown together, in which you're made, because of the sociological aspects of the language, you're made more aware of that. It attunes the ear, it possibly heightens the ear. I'm always looking for something that catches my ear when I'm writing. I don't want anything to sound dull or flat, unless there's a particular reason for that, of course. I want to keep it flowing. I might want to interrupt that flow. I might want a more jagged flow at times. I think maybe again there's something about us Scots that still ties us back a bit more to the oral tradition, even when we're being a bit more experimental. The ballads are still very important in Scotland. Folk music is still very important in Scotland. Obviously, the oral tradition is hugely important in the Gaelic-speaking culture in Scotland, and it's hugely important to Scots, the Scots language tradition as well. And particularly when you connect it with music, obviously the oral tradition, the music continues to be the oral tradition, a tradition which continues to grow and develop because people are always writing new songs in Scots to varying degrees. And my parents are interested in folk music, so I grew up with some awareness of that. And they're not so much interested in Gaelic, but they are interested in Scots folk music. So I think that probably comes into it. And how it functions within the book. I mean, there's no kind of overall attempt to have an overall music to the book. The poems that connect to one another do that simply are driven by those connections are driven by the theme and the subject matter and by the experiences. The sequence Pilgrim Variations was conceived to be a bit kind of like, sort of theme and variations, to have a more almost music-like approach towards the use of the words and images within the sequence, not necessarily music in the sense of no less than in any of my other poems, but wasn't thinking necessarily of the sound of the lines in that, but in the more formal overall conception of the poems as a sequence.
Right, the architecture of it was.
The architecture, yes, indeed.
One of the things I noticed too, you talked about kind of the oral tradition and the musicality, but you make wonderful and expansive use of the page. Some poems will be in this kind of stair step that expands throughout the page. Others will be tightly contained. You mentioned form. You have some that are in a kind of tanka form, and there's a real incredible variety. How does a poem find its line or find its music or find its way with you? Do you sort of hear something or catch something or have an idea, try a few things out, go through a lot of revisions. How does the writing process work for you to find your line, to find that intrinsic poem, what it wants to say and how it wants to shape itself?
Often it is there is quite a lot of revision. Sometimes there isn't. Most of the poems in that book underwent a considerable amount of revision. One or two that didn't, for example, Saxifrage, which I kind of came across again. I wrote the first draft of that actually when we were on holiday expecting my son Aidan, who died and to whom the book is dedicated. And after I began writing again after he died, I rediscovered that the first draft of that poem in my notebooks, and I thought at the time, this isn't up to much. But then when I revisited it in the light of that experience, in the light of the grief, I realized it was a poem about him and about losing him, and that it just needed one or two lines more, and it was almost there. It underwent a few small tweaks in between times, but nothing major. That poem was almost there from the beginning, which is an unusual experience for me. The poems that are in tankas were written actually on a writer on the Narvan Foundation writing course, where we were set the task of writing tankas, but that just seemed to fit with something that I wanted to write about at that point in time. The poem Cardiac, which is a sort of revision of the sonnet form, it can plays with the sonnet form, was part of a sonnet dialogue that the friend to whom it's dedicated, instituted between myself and himself and a couple of other friends. It didn't last very long, that dialogue, but it did give us at least that poem. And the Pilgrim Variations sequence it has a couple of more formal sonnets in it. But the rest of the poems in there kind of have the sonnet at the back of their minds, as it were, even though it might not look that way on the page. And there was a kind of I wanted as well to kind of play with and see how far I could push that kind of long line, short line form that crops up quite a lot throughout that sequence as well, and see how that would work.
Wonderful. You mentioned your son, to whom the book is dedicated, and that's an experience we share. And I never thought in my lifetime I would necessarily meet a poet, let alone such a wonderful poet, who shared that unique experience. I wonder if you'd say a little bit about what grief has taught you about life, about poetry. It sounds like there's a way in which dedicating the book to him sort of upped the ante, as it were, for you, made you really consider the solidity of each poem and consider it in a different light. So this is an incredibly hopeful book. This is a book of great experiment, great joy, and yet there is that undercurrent of grief. How did that come about? How has that changed you?
Well, it's as you know yourself, it's a hugely transformative experience, becoming a father and then losing the child in such a short space of time, and being a childless parent is such an indescribably difficult, painful, deeply painful experience. But still, there's the joy of parenthood, even in the midst of that grief. And there's the fact that that child was alive, was with us. And that, I've learnt from that, I suppose, if you put it down on the page and saying, I've learnt that life is precious, however short, it looks so incredibly banal. But when you see it and feel it and mean it, it's nothing. It's anything but banal. It's the word precious really does acquire such a weight of meaning. The word life acquires such a weight of meaning, and it seems to be blown open almost by that, the intensity of that experience, and how much impact my son's short life, as he he was with us only 45 minutes outside the womb. How much impact his life had on other people as well, just astounded me, and I made me very proud of him, proud to be his father. And as you go through life with this, where the pain, the grief, and the joy, emotions which may have seemed irreconcilable, that may have seemed disparate in the past, run alongside each other and interweave, perhaps not happily, but in a hugely enriching way. And I think that, that's what perhaps drives what I hope is some of the emotional richness of the poetry. I certainly hope that all that experience has broken me open to some extent. I hope it's maybe in many ways a more compassionate person.
Well, certainly, I certainly feel a lot of that intensity coming through this book. I think, if I'm one person's opinion, I would say that a lot of that intensity, that sense of being broken open to the experience of life, of celebrating life, just because it's so precious, it comes through in so many ways in this book. So, for me, congratulations on the hard, good work that you've done to bring that forward and bring that into the world. Wondering if you would take us out with one final poem. I was thinking possibly the poem Pedestrian, which was an earlier poem but has a number of resonances.
It is,
one I love. So I wonder if you would.
It's an interesting poem. This, in that it was in my first pamphlet, which was published just a few months before Aidan was born, and we didn't know that he wouldn't make it until just before he was born. And in fact, it was written before he was even conceived. So, and it was written with a very, very different scenario behind it. In fact, this a friend of ours who had taken her own life was initially what gave this poem its impotence, but a desire as well, even then, to celebrate her life and what she had given us and given other people. But obviously, as you know, and as you're watching this will hear, when you hear the poem, it took on a whole set of other references and associations after Aidan was born and died. A pedestrian. Someone was standing in the middle of the road. She stood astride it, just beyond the blind spot on a sharp countryside bend, so hidden that I nearly ran her over. At first, she seemed an ordinary figure. Jeans, a fitted t-shirt, long brown hair, but for the confidence with which she stood, where any car would slam straight into her. Almost as soon as we jerked to a halt, and I got out the car to remonstrate, the space around her ruptured with the opening of wings, as colourful as the flocks of paradise. She stretched her hand towards me, said, "I know you'll take good care of it," and poured from her palm into mine a sleeping child, scarcely the size of a nut, and sprouting from its belly a shoot topped off by a tiny leaf. I tried to ask the obvious questions, but she folded herself from our vision. I felt her gift stir slightly, though it slept as soundly as it does now in my hand. How can I drive on with this entrusted to me? I'm rooted here, keeping watch on the growth of what is planted in my palm, this difficult, unasked for joy.
Thank you, Andrew. That was wonderful. Would you just please remind people, I'm sure at this point they're desperate to learn your book, as they should be, where they can get the book and where they can learn a little bit more about you?
You can get the book directly from Salt Publishing at www.saltpublishing.com or on Amazon. I'm sure your local bookshop could order it in too. And you can find out a bit more about me at www.andrewphillip.net. That's Philip with one L, and no S on the end.
Great. Well, Andrew, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for doing this and
It's been
taking the time.
it's been a pleasure to do it from this end too.
All right.
Great to talk to you.